The air outside Buckingham Palace was crisp, a bright morning sun reflecting off the historic gates as tourists gathered in anticipation of the iconic changing of the guard. It was a moment of British tradition that had drawn crowds for generations, an opportunity to witness the unyielding discipline of the Queen's Guard, standing resolute in their red tunics and bearskin hats, unshaken by the outside world. Among the crowd was Arthur Hale, a 76-year-old retired British Army veteran who had served in the Falklands War. His face bore the weathered marks of a soldier's life. Deep lines etched from years of experience, a scar running just above his brow, and a sharp, unwavering gaze that still held the fire of a man who had seen real combat. Arthur had come to Buckingham Palace not as a tourist, but as a man reliving his past. He had served 25 years in the British Army, and seeing the guardsmen standing tall in their perfect formations filled him with a sense of pride. He leaned on his cane as he took in the sight, his old knee injury reminding him that time had caught up to him. But even now, he carried himself with the dignity of a soldier. Unfortunately, not everyone in the crowd respected that. Among the sea of visitors was a group of loud-mouthed troublemakers, young men in their early 20s, dressed in baggy streetwear, laughing and pointing at the royal guards as if they were part of some comedy routine. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered thug with tattoos creeping up his neck, had a particularly obnoxious presence. His name was Darren Cole, a career troublemaker with a criminal record for assault. He strutted through the crowd, shouldering past people without apology, scoffing at the disciplined soldiers in front of him. "These guys are a joke," Darren sneered to his friends, loud enough for everyone to hear. "They just stand there, pretending to be tough. I bet they wouldn't do a damn thing if someone actually got in their face." Arthur's jaw tightened, his grip on his cane firming. He had fought alongside men like these guards, had seen young soldiers die for their country, and now he had to listen to some punk belittle them? But he kept his silence, for now. Darren, however, wasn't done. He turned his attention to Arthur, noticing the veteran's military medals pinned to his coat. "Oi, Granddad," Darren smirked, stepping up to him. "You served, huh? What was it like back in the Stone Age?" Arthur lifted his gaze, locking eyes with the younger man. His voice was calm, steady. "I served so that little punks like you could have the freedom to act like idiots in public." The crowd murmured, sensing the tension. Darren's smirk faded. "You got a smart mouth for an old man." Arthur didn't blink. "And you've got a loud one for someone who's never had to fight for anything in his life." The insult stung, and Darren's ego couldn't handle it. His nostrils flared, and his muscles tensed as he took a threatening step forward, towering over Arthur. "You better watch yourself, old-timer," Darren growled. "You don't wanna." And then, in the blink of an eye, he threw a punch straight at Arthur's face. Gasps erupted from the crowd. But before Darren's fist could make contact, something explosive happened. One of the royal guards moved. In a blur of precision and trained combat efficiency, a tall, stoic guardsman in full uniform suddenly lunged forward, intercepting Darren's punch mid-swing. His gloved hand caught Darren's wrist, twisting it in a brutal grip that made the thug cry out in pain. And in that moment, everything changed. The moment Darren Cole's fist was intercepted, the entire crowd froze. The Royal Guards were legendary for their discipline, trained to remain unmoved regardless of the distractions around them. Tourists had spent years testing their limits, shouting at them, waving in their faces, and even trying to make them laugh, only to be met with stone-cold silence. But this was different. The second Darren attacked a civilian, he had crossed the unspoken line, and the Royal Guard reacted with brutal precision. The guardsman who had intervened was Lance Corporal Matthew Pierce, a former paratrooper who had served 2 tours in Iraq before being selected for the elite Queen's Guard unit. He had the unwavering composure of a soldier, but the raw strength of a man who had trained for combat his entire life. His grip on Darren's wrist was ironclad, his gloved fingers crushing against the punk's skin as he twisted the arm at a painful angle. Darren let out a guttural scream, his cocky bravado shattering instantly. "AGH, let go!" Lance Corporal Pierce's voice was cold, sharp, and commanding. You just attacked a civilian under the protection of the Royal Guard. You are now a threat. His words rang out like a judge's verdict, his tone filled with military authority. The crowd erupted in whispers, phones being whipped out to record the scene as Darren struggled in vain. Arthur Hale, the 76-year-old veteran Darren had tried to punch, stood unmoved, watching the young thug crumble under the grip of a true soldier. Darren's friends, who had been egging him on, suddenly went quiet. They hadn't expected this. They had assumed the Royal Guards were just stiff, ceremonial figures, standing there for photo ops and tradition. Now they realized the truth. They weren't just guards. They were warriors. The situation escalates. Darren, now panicked and humiliated, tried to yank his arm free, but Pierce's grip was unrelenting. I said let go, Darren bellowed, his voice cracking with fear. But Pierce didn't move. Instead, he did something that made the entire crowd suck in a collective breath. With one precise movement, he twisted Darren's wrist even further, forcing him down onto his knees. Darren let out a yelp of pain, his tough guy act completely shattered as he found himself kneeling before a soldier he had foolishly underestimated. That was when another Royal Guard stepped forward. This one, Corporal Daniel Briggs, was just as imposing as Pierce, with a hard-set jaw and the kind of physique that came from years of military training. His voice was calm but authoritative, as if he were simply stating a fact of war. You have just committed assault in front of a government-protected monument. You will be detained. Darren's eyes went wide. Wait, detained? He gasped, his breath coming in shallow bursts. It was just a joke, man. Just a joke. Arthur raised an eyebrow. Didn't look like a joke when you were throwing that punch, son. The crowd murmured in agreement, several people laughing at Darren's desperate attempt to talk his way out of it. That was when the Metropolitan Police arrived. A squad of 3 uniformed officers, led by Sergeant Michael Torrance, pushed through the spectators and took in the situation immediately. Their eyes flicked from the Royal Guards restraining Darren to Arthur, unharmed but standing tall, and then finally to the group of troublemakers who now looked ready to bolt. Sergeant Torrance stepped forward. What the bloody hell is going on here? Lance Corporal Pierce straightened, finally releasing Darren's arm as he stepped back into position with perfect military precision. This individual attempted to physically assault a civilian under our protection, Sergeant, Pierce reported, his voice crisp and unwavering. I restrained him to neutralize the threat. Torrance turned his gaze to Darren, who was still rubbing his throbbing wrist, his face a mix of shock, anger, and absolute embarrassment. The officer's eyes hardened. Cole, he muttered, recognizing the thug immediately. Darren flinched. Sarge, come on. Torrance held up a hand, silencing him. You again? Last time you were nicked for starting a pub fight in Soho, and now you think you can throw a punch in front of the damn Queen's guards. Darren's face turned red. It was just a misunderstanding. Shut it. Torrance turned to Arthur Hale. Sir, are you all right? Arthur nodded, his expression neutral. Never been better, officer. That young man thought he could take a swing at an old soldier and get away with it. He smirked. Turned out he was dead wrong. The crowd chuckled, murmuring amongst themselves. Darren's friends took a step back, clearly reconsidering their loyalty as the situation spiraled further out of control. Sergeant Torrance sighed, pulling out his handcuffs. Darren Cole, you're under arrest for assault and disorderly conduct. Darren's face drained of color. No, wait. Torrance grabbed his arm and snapped the cuffs on his wrists, silencing any further protests. As the officers hauled him to his feet, Arthur leaned in slightly, his voice just loud enough for Darren to hear. Let this be a lesson, son, he said. Some men don't need to prove their strength. They've already fought their battles. And some don't need to speak to command respect. They just stand, and the world knows who they are. Darren didn't reply. He just hung his head, fully realizing the weight of his stupidity. The aftermath. As Darren was led away, the crowd began clapping, not for the police, but for the Royal Guards, the silent sentinels who had reminded everyone why they were not to be underestimated. Arthur turned to Lance Corporal Pierce and nodded. "Good work, son." Pierce, still as disciplined as ever, didn't smile or acknowledge the praise. But there was a brief, subtle glint in his eyes, a flicker of silent camaraderie between two soldiers who understood each other without words. As Arthur began walking away, he overheard two tourists talking. "I always thought the Royal Guards weren't allowed to move." The other tourist laughed. "Guess that rule doesn't apply when you're an idiot trying to punch a veteran." Arthur smirked. Darren had learned the hard way, and the rest of the world, they had just been reminded of a very simple truth. You don't mess with a veteran, and you sure as hell don't pick a fight in front of the Royal Guard. The end.